Hi there. It's August the 17th, and we're continuing our journey through Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. We're in chapter 11, and we're reading from verses 1 to 16. Paul here is turning his attention to the relationships between the sexes in the church at Corinth. And perhaps there's a context that we need to look at here, because Paul is obviously addressing an issue that's arising there. There seem to be people who are following traditions and following patterns that are putting them into a place of disorder. And Paul is wanting to address this and bring some order. So what's important here is we see, and he refers to this in verse 16. He says this is a custom, or this is a tradition. Now it's important that we don't see this as law. We don't see this as a new Torah that Paul is laying down. He's very much speaking into the Corinthian tradition. And here's why. Very simple reason. Paul talks about a dishonor for a man to cover his head when he prays. Now, in the Jewish tradition, in the Jewish understanding, men do cover their heads to pray. And therefore, it's strange for Paul to say to a Corinthian group, you shouldn't be covering your heads, when obviously it is a Jewish tradition to cover your heads when you're praying. So he's obviously speaking to a situation in Corinth which is localized to them. And it seems to be particularly here perhaps that men covered their heads in the pagan sacrifices and in pagan worship. And therefore, if they're doing the same thing when they're praying to God whom they are free before, then there's too much of a connection with the pagan ways of worship. Similarly, when the women are praying with their heads uncovered, there's a danger of them being disrespectful or dishonored, because it seems to be that the prostitutes of Venus went around with their heads uncovered, which was thought unseemly for a woman to do. It also may be that there were converts from the prostitute class in Corinth who were coming into the church, and therefore for them to be seen with their heads uncovered made it too much of a temptation, or there was too much of a recognition of what their former life had been. There are various explanations the scholars give, but one thing it's really important to say is that Paul is giving here the teaching of custom. What he is saying as well is that there's an interdependence between the sexes. One sex can't do without the other. There's a blending, there's a counterbalance that God has put between the sexes that is worth respecting in order for us to together re-image who God is. It may well be in this situation, though we can't be sure, it may well be that there were some very strident women coming forward in Corinth who were making their voices heard. And it's not surprising, because following Messiah as believers gave men and women both a new freedom, slaves and free, a new freedom to speak out, a new freedom to be involved. And therefore it's all too easy for maybe a few strong people to really come to the fore. And particularly Paul is challenging here maybe strong women who were making their voices very much heard. What we're needing is a balance. What we're needing is a flow. So he says that there is a receiving of life from man to woman, just as there was in the creation story, but there's also men receiving life from women. So men are born of women. Basically, Paul is speaking for an interdependence of the two, just as there is a flow of life from Christ to his church. And when Paul uses the word kephali here in Greek, means head, he's not trying to put in place some hierarchy or something like a chieftainship. He's actually talking about a source, that just as the life flows around the body, goes through the head and comes back. So there's a life flow that is going on. This is more about life flow than it is about having power and being in charge. And so Paul is encouraging the people here he's encouraging the people in Corinth to follow customs that are seemly, follow customs as the other churches do, but to make sure that they are respecting and honouring one another in the midst of that. Have a very good August 17th.